Hello and welcome to Indus Special. I'm Meshal Malik. Recently, the global report on trafficking was released, and according to the UN's analysis of trends over 142 countries, there has been a significant increase in human trafficking. As alarming as this is, the report highlights another frightening fact. Children now account for 30% of those being trafficked. The ubiquity of child trafficking is undeniable. It exists all across the world, from developed countries to developing countries. But the fact that it is rising and more children are vulnerable to being separated from their homes and forced into a scary existence of exploitation requires us to explore the issue. Joining us today for this discussion is Iftikhar Mubarik, who's a rights activist. He's here with us in the studios, and Noor, who's a human rights activist. Thank you so much for joining us. Mr. Mubarik, let's begin with you. So the UN states that while we are seeing a rise in numbers in human trafficked victims, we are not sure as whether the detection of those who are trafficked is increasing or in fact the number is increasing. What can you tell us about that?
So I think, first of all, thank you very much for bringing this very important issue on the screen. And as far as the human trafficking is concerned, first we must have to understand, how we define the human trafficking. Basically, human trafficking is a trade of human for the purpose of forced labor, sexual slavery, and commercial sexual exploitation. So, and as you rightly mentioned, the reports of United Nations, the International Labour Organization, which is also a technical agency of the United Nations, that estimates that around 40.3 million individuals are victims of human trafficking, like globally. And 81% of the total human trafficking victims are engaged in forced labor.
Yeah.
While when it comes towards the further deep analysis of that 81%, 25% to 30, as you also mentioned, are under the age of 18. While the rest of 70 to 75% are women or girls. So while on the other side, when the ILO, being the technical agency of the United Nations, they also estimates that the forced labor industry costs around $150 billion globally.
Yeah.
So the issue of trafficking and the human trafficking and the child trafficking is not very much simple. It also linked with the global economy and things like this.
It's a very complex system at play there.
Yeah, it is.
Noor, we're talking about how the numbers are increasing and it's a very complex system. But in this very complex system, who do you think amongst the children is the most vulnerable to this exploitation, most vulnerable to child trafficking?
Hi, Meshal. Thank you for having me. I think as Iftikhar Mubarik Sahab has a lot of experience in this area. He's been a child rights activist for a long time. But I think that the most vulnerable population is definitely when it comes to rural areas. They're more vulnerable to this kind of exploitation than people in the urban area are, and that includes children, especially when we have the bonded labor issue, which is still rampant and is still going on. We have these limitations, and even these cases have been reported in Punjab and they've been reported in Sindh as well. But for some reason, like you mentioned earlier, that it's not just that these cases are increasing, or is it that they have always been there and they're now being reported more? So if you see there was a report on trafficking which the US State Department released last year actually. And according to them, in Punjab, the most cases have been identified in Punjab, and the government is investing in identifying cases in Punjab, which includes bonded labor issues, which includes sexual trafficking as well. And children, I think, are most vulnerable when they become part of the bonded labor class, or they become part of the,
So Noor, you're mentioning how, of course, there's more identification. Is there also enough prosecution happening of those involved in the child trafficking?
Yeah, so from what I know, from what my knowledge of the matter is, that Pakistani government is trying to address this issue. However, they have been able to identify more victims than there have been, prosecutions in the matter, because most cases have come forward from the Punjab government.
But I'm
They have
talking,
not only
Noor, I take your point and I appreciate it, but also from a global perspective, when we're talking about it, how difficult is it for the prosecution of child traffickers? Because as Iftikhar rightly mentioned here, it's a very complex system. Many key players are involved in it.
You're right. Many layers are involved in this, and especially globally, even it's a crisis not just for developing countries; it's a
Yeah.
crisis for developed countries as well. And you can take measures internationally, and there have been measures internationally that were taken. In 2010 there was an international trafficking case where children were trafficked from South Punjab and Sindh to UAE to be treated as camel jockeys.
Yeah.
So they banned camel jockeys to be children internationally, and UAE had to do that. And for the effect of that was that, then internationally they're not accepted, children aren't accepted as camel jockeys, so it makes it harder. So international interventions as such are needed, and they have to be present all over, because like we're discussing, it's not an issue limited to developing countries.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you mentioned the case happening in 2010, because in 2005, UNICEF and the UAE, they signed a pact in trying to tackle this issue. So we can see that it's, even though governments are involved, there are also many ways to circumvent the issue.
Actually helping them out, and how well they have been connected. If there is an action to be taken against them, then how do you bypass the influencers involved in the process? Because it's not just limited to somebody who stole kids.
Yeah.
Because there was an issue recently as well where nurses were reported of being a part of this. But it's just not just limited to the first person who's actually transporting kids. It's bigger than that.
Yeah. Noor, that's a great point, and hold on to that thought. Iftikhar, so I was talking about vulnerability here. So can you tell us how it increases when there's a crisis situation? For example, after the earthquake in Indonesia, there was alarming situation where children would be more prone to trafficking. And also we've seen throughout many of the other years during natural disasters. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, sure. Why not? I mean, in every natural disaster, puts children and women particularly, and the young girls as well, especially. Natural disaster put them on the risk as well. And they are more on risky situation, and they are more vulnerable towards trafficking. Like, for example, when a couple of years back in 2005, there was a earthquake in Pakistan. So even a number of children, they were trafficked from the flood of the earthquake affected area to the other part of the country. So trafficking, I mean, we can define it at the two different levels. One is like the international trafficking from border to border, and of course the one neglected area is basically the internal trafficking. Like if someone is basically trafficked from one part of the country to the other part of the country, so it's also like coming under the ambit of internal trafficking. So while on the other side, it's the right of every child under the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child that he or she will be provided all necessary protective services, so they could not be abducted, trafficked, or sold to anyone. But of course, there are still dire need to develop like standard operating procedures, some kind of guidelines and strategies, how we can prevent our children to be the victims of trafficking in cases of natural disasters.
Iftikhar, I do want to talk about all these policies and implementations at the legislative level that need to take place. But before that, I'd like you to take us step by step through the process of how child trafficking occurs. Is it through abduction mostly? Is it through selling of kids? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, when we see the past trends, so there are like there were many cases in which a child was abducted, and there are some cases like as Noor was like sharing the example of Rahim Yar Khan camel jockey's case. So I mean, children were basically trafficked with the full consent of their parents, and the traffickers, they were paying amounts to the families of the children, and they were basically traveling those children to the UAE.
And would would these parents know what these children are going cross boundaries for? Do the child traffickers, in fact, inform them? Do they know, or do they think they're going for some other purpose and then something else happens?
Yeah, in majority cases, when we had some interaction with those camel jockeys, so they told us that the traffickers basically told their families that we are just like sending your child to the UAE to work as domestic servant, to work at someone's home. So he or she will, I mean, because the majority of those like victims were the boys. So the traffickers told their families that we are sending them just for the work, and their parents were not even informed that what kind of job there would be in terms of camel jockeys or things like this. But in very few cases, we also observed that the traffickers informed the parents that why we are paying you to get your child, because your child will be engaging in serving the different like individuals as camel jockeys in UAE. So, I mean, there were again a mixture of trend, but the majority of the parents were not aware.
So it was complete deception on the part of who were doing this. Can you tell us on that point, what do parents need to look out for? Of course, these individuals who are involved in child trafficking are exploiting a situation, whether it's poverty or a crisis situation. But what do parents need to look out for in awareness?
Of course, this is very important to understand that no one has the right, even the parents don't have the right to violate the child's best interest. So that is a very primary thing which we must like have to propagate through our media or things like this, that children are the complete human. So when a parent must be careful when very like unknown person, or to some extent unknown person, is coming asking that he or she can facilitate to get a good job for their child. So even in recent years, we observe even within our own country, there was a very prominent case of Tayyiba case in which a 10-year-old girl was serving as domestic worker, and that particular girl was sent to the home of a third party with the consent of the parents. And even that was also a part of cruelty, that when there was it revealed that that particular girl is suffering physical violence. So the parents came forward and they submit the document for the compromise. So parents must be careful.
Yeah. And caution is necessary here. And Noor, I want to ask you, we mentioned camel jockeys previously, but what are the main reasons as to why children are trafficked? Because we know that the reasons may vary from region to region. It might be different in a developing nation or in a developed nation. In the UK and in the US, it's more about drugs. So can you tell us all the reasons for which children are trafficked?
You're right, Meshal. It's a range of reasons depending on the country's context. And if we're talking about Pakistan, I think the most prominent areas that have come forward has been in crises like we talked about. Conflicts within the country which have forced people to be displaced. So IDPs, they're very vulnerable to trafficking and all sorts of exploitation. And then we have bonded labor, which exists in Sindh and Punjab as well. And these two areas have been the most...
but I'd also like for you to comment on the developed nations and what exactly happens there, because the assumption is that the rules and regulations and the laws would be much more stringent. There would be a greater protection of children. So I'd like you to shed some light on that.
Yeah, there is greater protection, obviously, because there's a stricter implementation of laws in the developed countries, but they're not immune to this problem either. Like you said, there are issues when it comes to trafficking, to be involved in gangs for drug abuse. There's trafficking when immigrants are involved, basically internationally. Like we're looking at the migration crisis right now. A lot of people who are migrating through these borders because of conflict or entering developed nations because of conflict in their own countries, they are more vulnerable to these issues. They will be exploited for different areas. And even if we're talking about the international scenario, even in Pakistan, the children and women and these vulnerable groups have been trafficked to Pakistan as well, which includes Uzbekistan, which includes Afghanistan, which includes the Central Asian regions. And human trafficking to Pakistan has also happened.
Yeah.
So I think there's a multitude of reasons behind it. There's a need for stricter monitoring, stricter implementation. Like, for example, in Pakistan, FIA looks after human trafficking, but they're just coming up with new trainings on how they can be more vigilant and all of that. So it's a very complicated issue, definitely.
And one of the statistics I have here is that 136,000 modern day slaves reside in Britain currently. And I want to understand, what are these modern day slaves doing over there, and specifically in terms of children?
Modern day slavery, yes. Modern day slavery is a very complicated concept, because I think even today, like I mentioned, migrants. So migrant workers are internationally, they have to undergo jobs. Their jobs, yes, they take on jobs which are paid very, very less. They will be not sufficient to cater to a family. They will not be sufficient to provide for a family. But they do like 3 jobs in a day to survive in a country because they're illegal immigrants, right? So a lot of these things, a lot of exploitation, and especially modern day slavery, comes from the fact that maybe those people are there illegally, or maybe those people are being exploited because they don't have the right knowledge as well. Because, for example, if we are internationally, we're seeing a ban on immigrants, right? Internationally, we're seeing these organizations being banned. But it was also debated in the UN that banning might not be the right approach, because banning just creates more ways for illegal stuff to happen.
Because if you have to get across a border to save your life, you have to do it. There's no way around that.
Yeah, exactly.
And on that point, Noor, I'd also like to welcome another guest, Detho, who is a human rights activist. Thank you for joining us. Mr. Iqbal, so we've been talking about the reasons as to why children are trafficked. But my question now is, what is the international community doing to mitigate this issue, especially since it's not something that's restricted to one country? It's almost an international phenomenon in which many countries are also linked with each other.
Yeah, when we talk about the efforts at international level to curb these things, no doubt the one thing which at the international level is done, that is to set the minimum standards which outlaw the practice, which you mentioned, slavery or slavery-like modern forms of slavery or slavery conditions. If you can trace back to the history, you see it's the Anti-Slavery International, and then it's the Anti-Slavery Convention, which was earlier adopted in 1926 under the auspices of the League of Nations, which was established in 1919. From that, you saw of the particularly vulnerable groups, the children and women who were exploited either in the workplace or in other places. So safeguards were put in place under the League of Nations. That was the Anti-Slavery Convention. And then if we move forward toward the United Nations, and after that you see that there was a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And in Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Article 4, which talks about the prohibition of the slavery and slavery-like and slave trade. And furthermore, we saw that in 1956, the United Nations have again a legal framework at the international level which outlawed the slavery and forced labor and bonded labor and many other forms which have the attributions like the slavery. So that is the one legal framework, and other one was the institutions for monitoring the compliance of the member states. So even in 1946, the ILO was also attached with the UN, and then also the ILO has two conventions. One is the ILO Convention 129, which talks about the forced labor and the slavery and the slave trade. And then again, ILO Convention 105.
And Mr. Iqbal, what about specifically when it comes to child trafficking? What are the specific measures being taken right now?
Depends, and it varies from country to country, and it has different contextual approaches.
Yeah.
If we, because globally you see that the major source of child trafficking is the migration, the refugees, the internal displaced persons. Then again, you see the civil conflicts and the war-torn countries.
And Mr. Iqbal, since you've mentioned that, and it's a very important point, I'd like you to hold on to that thought. And I also want to ask Iftikhar here. So he mentioned how context is very important. And under the Child Soldiers Prevention Act of 2008 in the US, 11 countries were banned from being given aid precisely because they were using child soldiers. But still, the president has a power to waive it, and 7 of those countries are still being given aid. So my question now comes is, when there is so much conflict going on and vulnerability increases, how does this impact the insidiousness of child trafficking? How does it create more pathway for it in terms of child soldiers and terrorist groups?
Yeah. So, I mean, it would be very much pertinent to mention here that the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child has a special protocol, which is involvement of children in armed conflict. And luckily, Pakistan is among those countries who have ratified that particular optional protocol to UNCRC. Coming back again, the very important issue, I would just like to touch 2 major things. Number one, when you talked about the modern form of slavery,
yeah,
I mean, so when you asked the question from the Noor, Imran, so the special rapporteur of United Nations to contemporary form of slavery, she declares that the child domestic labor, the children, those who are working in the house of a third party, that situation is called or considered as modern form of slavery.
Because their consent isn't involved, it's their parents' consent that is involved.
So, and due to some other reasons as well, because I mean, because of many reasons, so they consider that that particular form of labor is considered as a contemporary form of slavery, modern form of slavery. And when Iqbal was also referring some documents of ILO and some statistics as well, so the Global Slavery Index report reveals that even when we talk about the global issues and when we more specifically talk about the issues of Southeast Asia, we are the second largest region which is having more prevalence than any other regions of the world, which is around 6.1 per thousand. So, and there is also another report by the International Labour Organization that every 4 victims of trafficking, 1 is the child. So, of course, that all situation puts children at risk as well.
You also mentioned South Asia here, but another country that's also very increasingly vulnerable, and we hear a lot of stories coming out, is the region of Africa.
Yes.
Central African Republic, Congo, a lot of child soldier stories coming out of there. Can you shed some light on it? What is happening over there?
Of course. I mean, you can see a very visible connection between the human trafficking, child soldier, and the poverty as well.
What is that visible connection? Explain to our viewers.
I mean,
as well.
visible connection mean that the African regional, countries, you mentioned for example, Congo, Somalia, and other countries. Yeah. So they are going, through the conflicts, wars, or things like this. So in that particular, and those regions are basically suffering through this situation since the last many years. So, and of course, their economy has been destroyed. The economic generation activities are not here. So, that are basically a major contributing and pushing factor, which push the children to engage with the armed groups or, become the victims of trafficking as well.
And on that same similar note, Noor, I'd also like to ask you about regional issues. article came out in the New York Times which talked about Afghanistan's conundrum of dealing with children who were imprisoned because of their links to having terrorist organizations. So I want to understand how important is the clause of non-criminalization when children who are victims of child trafficking are found and they are recovered?
I think it's very important, Meshal. Like, the recovery process requires a lot of effort, requires a lot of time, and that's the one of the recommendations that internationally comes across for Pakistan, for all of the countries facing these issues. That once you've recovered children, then you need to provide them with counseling services. Then you need to rehabilitate them, and that requires a lot of resources. That requires a lot of time. That requires a lot of commitment as well. And you're talking about Afghanistan, and we were talking about international issues and international laws and regulations. The UN, like Iftikhar just mentioned, that the UN has a CRC document that has been ratified by Pakistan, but they have been able to achieve a lot of success as well. We're talking about Africa. There's a country called Burkina Faso where UNICEF, through UNICEF's efforts, children were taken out of gold mines. They were used to mine gold in those areas, and they were trafficked for that from across the region of Africa. So interventions like these have taken place, but what do you give them after you've taken them out of that situation?
Yeah.
And even in Pakistan, there are laws that exist. Obviously, there's a law that exists against bonded labor as well. But the gaps in international laws and within Pakistani laws can be found where you see the definitions of those are like, if somebody has been coerced into like sexual slavery, or if somebody has been coerced into a bonded labor, only then you're supposed to take action. But if somebody does not even know what bonded labor is, even if they're informed that this is what you're going to be doing, it's still wrong if they're in it. So you have to identify these gaps and then take steps to actually rehabilitate the same children, the same people back to the communities as well.
And that is very imperative, Noor, that rehabilitation, in fact, is after a child is recovered. Thank you for talking to us, Noor. Mr. Iqbal, I'll take the question to you. So we were talking about recovery and rehabilitation, but before that, I'd like to move a few steps back. How can individuals in the society identify victims of child trafficking and report this to the authorities?
Yeah. Can I add a little bit more, which you earlier talked with my two co-panelists for the benefit of the viewers and the listeners, that we need to differentiate between the child soldiers and the victims of the child trafficking, because the UN Convention on the Rights of Child, which talks about that you cannot recruit any person below the age of 18 for the enlistment into the military or in the actual combat on the military field. So that gap was missing, and then the optional protocol 2 on the involvement of children into the armed conflict was enacted. So in many countries, the military forces, they recruit the child below the age of 18 and they allow them to combat on the field. That is the one element. The second element which you mentioned, that many militant organizations are the other, which we call the non-state actors, they recruit them. Like in the context of the Asia, you had seen whether in Sri Lanka, it was the Tamils, which they used the child soldiers. In the context of the Nepal, you saw the Maos who used the child soldiers. In the context of the Afghanistan, you saw the child soldiers. So even in Pakistan, you saw in those areas where the effective jurisdiction of the government was not in place. So in those areas,
children
but
were
even
much more
here,
vulnerable.
in other parts of our country, the children are also used into the tribal clashes. So that is the child soldier is one aspect. Yes, sometimes children are forcibly, by coercion and by force, they are compelled to join the ranks of the soldiers. So we have a link with the child trafficking.
And Mr. Iqbal, I understand here the point you're trying to make, that of course, law and order is disrupted completely. There is no way of trying to understand what's happening. And thank you for sharing that point, and thank you for joining us on the show today. We're going to take a short break, and when we're going to return, we're going to continue this discussion. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. Let's continue our discussion regarding child trafficking. Now we are joined by Ramesh Jaipal, who was a former camel jockey, and also Mr. Arshad Mahmood, who is a child rights activist. Thank you so much for joining us. Ramesh, I'd like to begin with you. Can you please tell us about your experience?
I'm Ramesh Jaipal. Currently, I'm a human rights activist in Rahimyar Khan, Punjab, Pakistan. In the 90s, due to poor economic condition, my family sent me to United Arab Emirates, where I spent 5 years more as a camel jockey, camel rider. And that time, a child need a love from their family, want to play games with their friends, and like that. But that time, in a 106 foreign degree, I spent 5 years as a camel jockey. I take care of the camel. I ride a camel, and also I scrubbing the camel. In 5 years is 1990 to 95. And after the involvement of United Nations and UNICEF, they restored me from United Arab Emirates to Pakistan. Not only me, there is a lot of thousands of children from Pakistan, some Bangladesh, India, Sri Lanka, and some other countries.
Ramesh, for people in our audience and our viewers who don't completely understand the sport and don't understand the gravity of the situation, can you please take us step by step through what being a camel jockey entails? What happens when you ride the camel, and what happens during that activity?
Okay, there in a United Arab Emirates, there's a they played a game like in a race in a United Arab Emirates, and that they need a child who's the thin, especially for the thin child who's the underweight is and the age is 5 to 10 year old. So they brought from the different South Asian countries, and there the child is a ride a camel as a camel rider and in a race. And during the race, I seen a lot of my friends or my colleague were dead due to due to the accident and some mishap happening in the race. And it's a race happening in the November to January, in a 3 or 4 months they are in the race. And after that, the kids and the other people, they're taking care of the camel, they're scrubbing the camel, they're giving the food and all those other things.
And Ramesh, you told us how you traveled from here to the UAE, but can you tell us exactly how that happened? Did you travel? How did you get there during that process?
Okay. Actually, there is a lot of people who's working in Pakistan and some other countries. They are like agent, and they contact with the parents, and the parents receive not a money. They not sold them, but they send them due to economic condition. And as well as similar as my family was economically poor, so they send me to UAE due to the low income of my family, so they send me there.
So Ramesh, since your parents' consent was there when you were going, did you fly through air? How was the immigration process? Can you tell us about that?
Okay, there's a very simple immigration process. Is if some person actually there is a criteria by the United Arab Emirates that time. And they told if some person like adult need a job, so he bring one kids for a camel rider in UAE. So my relative want to go to UAE for a work or for a labor, but there is a I think that there is a clause that if you want to come in UAE as a labor, as a camel labor in a camel raiding, then you must bring one kids. So my family, they contact with my family, and my family send me to the with my relative in UAE, and I went there. And when I was the child, they sent me because I want to need to see an aeroplane, and the people said me that you are going for the seeing the aeroplane and the big city and the big cars and the something. So I go easily with him, and when I was in a loaded, or what I say, the boarding and everything, and then after the process I went in by the aeroplane to the United Arab Emirates. In the first few days, as like there is a trend, or there is a not a trend, there is a in the beginning, the child or the kid, they spend the month or two in the house of the arbab or the kafil or the some of the owner who bring us the businessman who bring who invite us for the job. So because they familiar with the
Ramesh,
kids and something, and not a
your story is very gripping, and I definitely want to return to that. And thank you for sharing that. But while we're talking about it, I also want to ask Mr. Arshad, listening to Ramesh's story, what do you think is imperative to do in a situation in terms of awareness? So many kids like him exist all around the world. What do we need to do better?
I think as far as Ramesh's case is concerned, or trafficking of children from Pakistan to the Gulf states for camel jockeys, that's a serious issue. However, I would like to mention here that the government of Pakistan took some steps for external trafficking. And the Prevention of Human Trafficking Ordinance 2002 was introduced, and now I think the incidence of international trafficking has been reduced to some extent. However, when it comes to internal trafficking of children or women or persons, that is still very common, and for that there is a need of inter-provincial coordination. There is a need for legislation to protect children from trafficking.
And Mr. Arshad, what about the process of retrieving back those children who have been identified as victims? What is the repatriation process like?
It was done with the help of UNICEF, as Ramesh mentioned, and then here in Pakistan, the Child Protection and Welfare Bureau in Punjab, they were involved in the process, and the provincial governments for the rehabilitation and reintegration of those children with their families and into the society. But I think that process needs to be more to be strengthened, and those children needs to be followed up with for their proper rehabilitation. And similarly, I think it's very important to make sure that no more children, they are trafficked and they go through the same fate as Ramesh and others have been through. And Rahim Yar Khan, it was famous for the trafficking of children as camel jockeys, and now it's famous for internal trafficking and children being used in child domestic labor in the houses in Karachi, in Lahore, in Islamabad, in the big cities. So the issue of trafficking is still there.
Yeah, and Mr. Arshad, something that you mentioned was the importance of reintegrating those children back into society. And I will take this question to Iftikhar. How imperative is it to do that, the reintegration of children back into the society in normal life?
Yeah, of course, this is very important area. And as earlier the Noor was mentioning that in the rehabilitation and reintegration of a child victim of trafficking back into society requires a continuous engagement with the child and his family. It also includes the provision of psychological support services to both child victim and their family, but which we in Pakistan are badly lacking. And like the importance of psychological counseling is never been recognized even in the cases of very worst cases of sexual abuse, the domestic violence cases, and many cases where it was like standardized, there are standardized guidelines of the United Nations, WHO, that person requires the psychological support services. But unfortunately, we don't have that kind of expert psychological support services for the victims of trafficking or things
And
like
Mr.
this.
Iftikhar, can you expand upon the psychological trauma that is inflicted upon the child, not only after they've returned, but also during the process of when they are first snatched away from their families? What psychological impact does that leave on the child?
Of course, I can just like briefly comment about on the trauma because I am not a psychological expert. But even when the government bring back the camel jockeys from the UAE, so there were many those even they were shocked in the shock situation. They were not even able to speak, and they had lose their confidence, and many of them were also like beaten by their employers at that time. So I mean that kind of like sudden situation because children were not prepared to face that kind of very worst condition.
Yeah.
So I mean even at the very like at the local level, we can also see like in many cases where the government and the government agencies they rescued the children from the homes of third parties where they were working as child domestic laborers. When they rescued them, they were even not able to tell them what happened with them, who was the person actually involved, who was beating to that particular child. So because a child is always an innocent, he or she don't have that kind of like maturity to
Understand.
reflect about his or her emotions or feelings or things like this.
And Mr. Iftikhar, I think it's very important to ask Ramesh the experience and the trauma he faced after his experience. Ramesh, please tell us about that.
Thank you very much again. And I would like to again share that after the intervention of United Nations in 1995, the child trafficking for the camel jockey is stopped. Now the time the United Arab Emirates people are using the reward for the camel riding. And second is, I would like to share also with the Child Protection Bureau of Punjab. The Child Protection of Bureau of Punjab is also involved to restoring the children or kids from UAE and from other countries as well. And as you know, that time is as in my life is a very horrific. When I thinking about my past as a camel jockey, I unable to sleep in the night because that time I need a lot. I need play with my friends and a lot of things. But you know, in my eyes, I've seen a lot of my friends were dead and a lot of people are injured. My friends were injured. As well, me, I'm also injured in my head injury. There is another like in a 4 inches injured in my head. So very, I have no word to explain the pain which I feel when I remember my past.
And Ramesh, you being speechless about it, I can feel your pain, and I'm sure it's very traumatic to even relive it. But you, after you returned, you have become immensely successful. Tell us about the experience afterwards when you returned home. How did you go on a path in which you were able to reintegrate yourself in the normal society, but also able to excel?
To Pakistan with the support of United Nations and Child Protection Bureau of Punjab. I was here and I started my education and I was in a 10-year-old. So I am taller in my class and I sit behind in the last row of my classroom and I studied in a school, in a government school, and I get a jumped class in the first grade and then third grade, then fifth grade, then seventh grade, and eighth and 10th. And with the jumped classes, I complete my matriculation. And once again, the circumstances around me and economic condition of my family and as well mine, they said to stop the education. So I again the stop and work as a different blue collar jobs in a menial jobs. I wind out newspapers and I sell out the kite, sell out the balloon. I work with the saverman, and I'm also taxi driver and rickshaw driver. And during that period, in a 5 to 7 8 year, again I started my education and I completed my diploma in commerce, and then I completed a graduation, and after that in a master in sociology. So I earned my degree in master in sociology with the when with another sport, it's due to work as a worker in a different jobs, in different menial jobs, and after that I got my degree in master in sociology.
Meshan, your story is remarkable. You are an extremely hardworking individual who has gained so many successes in life, and we hope that you continue to do so. Thank you so much for talking to us. Mr. Arshad, previously we were talking about how the UN has said that there is a spike in child trafficking cases, and we said that it's also there's an ambiguity present there, whether there's an absolute increase or there's just more data being collected. Can you tell us the importance of collecting more data on this issue?
Obviously, I think it's very important to collect data, and that is the issue we are facing in Pakistan as well. That there is a lack of data about these issues. And secondly, I would like to reiterate that when we talk about trafficking, so generally it is thought that it's international trafficking from Pakistan to other countries. So as Ramesh mentioned, and we know that there are some positive steps on that side, but equally important and I think alarming is internal trafficking. And for internal trafficking of children, it's very important to focus on that. And that's still an issue. And for that, we need to have a database of children, girls and boys trafficked. We need to have databases of traffickers, people who are involved in this. And the new aspects of child trafficking in Pakistan, as I mentioned earlier, child domestic labor, use of children for prostitution, use of children for begging in big cities. So these new dimensions of child trafficking are there, and it requires the special attention of the government of Pakistan and the provincial governments.
Mr. Arshad, on that similar note, I'd like to take my last question to Mr. Iftikhar here. What is the way forward in terms of creating awareness? What do we need to do more as a society?
Of course, I mean, at the government level, I would like to reiterate that there is still dire need to launch comprehensive campaigns about understanding like the signs, symptoms, situations in which a child or even an adult can be trafficked. So, I mean, there is absolutely, no excuse that, about the importance of that particular issue of awareness raising about that particular issue. In addition to that, I also personally feel that, our curriculum can also play a very important role in terms of educating our new generation about understanding the concepts or things associated or
nuances.
The nuances. Like, for example, if you can just add a chapter or a page in textbooks at different level, what trafficking is, you can just make some kind of picture, and you can just, so the children can understand, the young people can understand, and even at the university level, you can introduce some new courses about understanding the modern development about trafficking of children and even for the adults as well. So in addition to this, the parents must also develop their friendly relationship with their children, so the children can share their problems, their concern, their issue with them. And even in that particular case, when some adult is trying to bribe the child or trying to they
feel comfortable in reaching out.
To their parents. Yeah.
And thank you so much, Mr. Iftikhar, for sharing that point. That's a very holistic view of how we should move forward. Thank you for also coming here and sharing your views with us. Thank you, Mr. Arshad, for talking to us. It was great to have you. That's all the time we have with Indus Special today. We hope to see you again tomorrow.